The Eye of a Funeral Director. Episode 9. What the Walls Carry. Prologue. The bread came out of the oven at 5, which meant Marco was on the road by 1:15. The trays stacked and towel-covered in the back of the van while Mirefield stayed dark around him. Late February held on to its nights the way an old man held on to an argument, past the point anyone remembered the original reason for it. The sun wouldn't clear the tree line for another hour yet, and when it did, it would sit there thin and white, giving off light without giving off much else. St. Raphael's kitchen door was unlocked, same as always. Father Dom was already inside, sleeves pushed up, running a rag over the long steel counter that would hold 200 plates of pasta by evening. "You're earlier than the bread needs to be," Father Dom said, without turning around. "Habit." Marco set the first tray down and started unloading. "Figured you'd want the ovens free before the real work starts." "The real work started an hour ago." Father Dom nodded at a stack of folding chairs leaning against the far wall, a project clearly abandoned mid-thought. "Sciatica had other plans for me this morning." "You want help with those?" "I want you to drink the coffee I'm about to make you and tell me the bread's paid for. Because I already know the answer, and I like hearing you say it anyway." Marco smiled and didn't argue. It was an old rhythm between them, the price always offered and always waved off. Going back to before Marco's father died, back further than that if you asked Father Dom, who liked to remind people the arrangement predated most of the parish's living memory. Marco set the last tray on the rack and let the kitchen's warmth work into his hands. "Big turnout tonight." "Bigger every year. Half the parish, and some who haven't set foot in here since the last one." Father Dom poured 2 cups without asking. "Rose DeMarco's already called twice to ask if we need extra folding tables. I told her the same thing I tell her every year. That you have enough tables? That I have enough tables." Father Dom handed him a cup. "She'll bring one anyway." They talked for a few minutes more about nothing that mattered the parish roof, a delivery that hadn't shown up, a couple getting married in June who wanted the reception in the same hall Marco was standing in now. Outside, the sky had gone from black to the flat gray that came before actual light, and by the time Marco left, carrying nothing back with him but the empty crates, the sun still hadn't managed more than a suggestion above the rooftops. By 7 that evening, the hall was a different place entirely. Every light was on, and someone had strung the folding tables end to end with white cloths that didn't quite match. And it didn't matter, because the room was too full of noise and steam and the smell of garlic bread to care about matching cloths. Marco came back for the tail end of it, mostly to help break things down, and found himself instead handed a plate before he'd said 2 words to anyone. "You'll eat first," Agnes Kowalski told him, in the tone that ended the conversation before it started. "Break down the tables on a full stomach or don't break them down at all." He ate. The parish hall filled the shape it took only a few times a year, every folding chair occupied, kids weaving between the tables with the energy of children allowed to stay up past a normal bedtime. Somebody's grandmother, 2 tables over, laughing loud enough to carry over the noise. Father Dom moved table to table with his collar loosened and a paper plate balanced on one palm. The watchful warmth he brought to everything settling over the whole room like something you could feel on your skin. Rose DeMarco held court near the dessert table, as she did every year. A small crowd of old parishioners gathered loosely around her, drawn in by someone who told good stories and told them well. "And I said to him, I said, 'You'll not get me on that Ferris wheel again if you paid me,'" Rose was saying, to general laughter, one hand resting on the table for balance and the other gesturing with a fork that had long since abandoned its cake. 78 years old, and I still remember exactly how sick I felt coming down. "You were 30 when that happened, Rose," someone said. "I was 30, and I still remember it like it was this morning. That's the point." She laughed at herself, easy and unbothered, and reached for her coffee. "That old neighborhood. I don't think about it enough anymore. You forget how much used to happen down there before it was all torn up." "The old workshop district," someone else offered, Ferraro's used to be 3 buildings over from where it is now, didn't it? Before the fire? Before the fire, Rose agreed, nodding slowly, her eyes going somewhere private for a second before coming back to the table. I remember that night. You know, walking home from my cousin's. Must have been near midnight. Saw a young fellow coming out the back of the place not 20 minutes before it went up. If my memory's not fooling me, which it might well be at my age. She waved the fork again, dismissing her own memory with the same ease she'd dismissed the Ferris wheel. Whatever happened to him? I wonder. I wonder if he even remembers that night the way I do. Nobody at the table treated it as anything but an old woman's fond, meandering recollection. Because that's exactly what it was. Offered without weight, received without weight, gone from the conversation within a breath as someone else picked up a different thread about the old neighborhood and the talk moved on. Rose herself had already turned to refill her coffee before the sentence finished landing on anyone. Marco, clearing plates 2 tables over. Caught none of it directly. He was in and out of the kitchen with trays, the low murmur of 200 conversations blending into one continuous sound, indistinguishable from itself. It was on his 4th trip back to the kitchen, arms full, that he noticed it. Not through the hall itself, but through the old wall separating the kitchen from the side corridor. A wall thin enough and old enough that the church's original architects apparently hadn't planned on anyone needing privacy on either side of it. 2 voices, low, close together. One of them pitched in a register that didn't belong at a fundraiser dinner. He couldn't make out words, couldn't have said, if asked. Whether it was an argument or something quieter than that, trying not to look like one. One voice sounded rattled, the other he couldn't place at all. He set the tray down, listened for another second out of nothing more than the ordinary curiosity anyone would have, and then let it go. People stepped out of loud rooms to say things they didn't want overheard all the time, a marriage having a rough night, someone getting bad news by phone, an old friction between 2 people that had nothing to do with him. It wasn't his business. And there was nothing in the tone, brief as it was, that suggested it needed to be. He picked the tray back up and went to find Father Dom, who was trying, with limited success, to convince a table of teenagers to help him fold chairs. The night went on being what it was. Loud, warm, full of a community that had been showing up for each other in this exact room for longer than Marco had been alive. Rose left a little after 9, walked out on Tony Ferraro's arm because he was headed the same direction, and it was cold and dark, and Tony was, as everyone in the parish would have told you, the kind of man who noticed things like that and did something about them without being asked. Nobody thought anything of it. There was nothing yet to think of it. Ruth Palmieri had called Rose DeMarco every morning at 8:15 for 11 years. Ever since Rose's husband died, and the 2 of them had settled into the habit without either of them ever formally deciding to. It wasn't a long call. Rose answered on the 2nd ring, usually already dressed, usually already annoyed at something small on the morning news. And they'd talk for 5 minutes about nothing much before getting on with their days. It was an arrangement 2 women fell into, less because they needed it, and more because it was pleasant, and because it meant somebody knew, every single morning, that the other one was still there. At 8:15, the phone rang 4 times before the machine picked up. Ruth tried again at 8:30. Same thing. She told herself it was nothing. Rose had slept in before, had once missed the call entirely because she'd fallen asleep in her chair with the television on, had another time simply forgotten the phone was unplugged after vacuuming. There were a dozen ordinary explanations, and Ruth ran through most of them standing in her own kitchen with the phone still in her hand, the coffee going cold behind her. By 9, she had her coat on. It was a short walk, 4 houses down. A distance that had never once felt significant until this particular morning made it feel like it might be. Ruth knocked, waited, knocked again, harder, and called Rose's name through the door loud enough that Mrs. Okafor next door came out onto her own porch to see what the trouble was. The spare key was where it had always been, under the ceramic frog by the back step, an arrangement Rose had made with Ruth years ago and joked about more than once, in case I ever break a hip and need somebody to find me before I turn into a story people tell at the fair. Ruth let herself in through the kitchen. The house was quiet, in the specific way houses get when something in them has stopped. She found Rose in the bedroom, still in the nightgown she must have put on after the dinner, looking for all the world like a woman who had simply gone to sleep and not woken up. It took Ruth a full minute standing in the doorway before she could make herself go any closer, and another minute after that before she could make her legs carry her back out to the kitchen phone to call for help. News like that didn't travel through Mirefield so much as it settled over it. Within the space of a morning, Ruth calling Mrs. Okafor, Mrs. Okafor calling her sister at the diner, the sister mentioning it to a table of regulars who each went home and mentioned it to somebody else. Marco heard it from Sal, standing at the counter waiting on a coffee he'd already half forgotten he'd ordered. "Rose DeMarco," Sal said, wiping down a spot on the counter that didn't need it. "Ruth found her this morning. They're saying it was her sugar, the diabetes. Went in her sleep, apparently." Marco set his cup down without drinking from it. Last night, at the dinner, she looked fine. Better than fine. She was telling stories half the evening. That's how it goes sometimes. From what I understand, rich meal, a long night. Maybe she forgot to check herself before bed the way she should have. Sal shook his head, the kind of shake reserved for news that was sad without being surprising. The sort of thing that happened to women Rose's age with Rose's condition often enough that nobody in town would think twice about the shape of it. 78's not young. It happens. It happens, Marco agreed, because it did. Because there was nothing yet in what Sal had said that gave him any reason to think otherwise, and because Rose DeMarco had been diabetic for as long as Marco had known her, had talked about her insulin routine so casually and so often that half the parish could probably have recited her morning schedule back to her. He finished his coffee slower than he meant to. Rose had brought him a foil-wrapped plate of her almond cookies not 2 weeks ago, unprompted, as she did every so often for no occasion at all, just because she'd made too many and didn't want them going stale. He still had the container on his kitchen counter at home, washed and waiting to be returned to her. The call from the DeMarco family came a little before noon. Danny, Rose's grandnephew, sounding hollow and careful in the specific way people sound on the phone in the hours right after, asking DeMarco to come by that afternoon to talk about arrangements. She never wanted anything complicated, Danny said, more to himself than to Marco. She used to say that, told me a dozen times, "Don't you go making a fuss over me when I'm gone." "We'll do it exactly the way she'd have wanted," Marco said, and meant it, and had no reason at that moment to think the conversation would end up being anything other than what it appeared to be, a quiet, ordinary loss, the kind the town absorbed and grieved and moved past every year, the kind Marco had handled 100 times before, without a single thing about them turning out to be other than they seemed. The van was brought around a little after 2. Rose came to Castellano and Sons the same way she'd come to every fundraiser dinner and every bake sale and every Sunday mass for decades, quietly, without fuss, exactly as she'd have wanted it. Chapter 2. The Embalming Room. The church bells from St. Raphael's carried on a clear morning, faint enough that most people in town had stopped hearing them at all. Background noise worn smooth by years of repetition. Marco heard them anyway, working alone in the prep room with the exhaust fan humming low and the overhead light doing its steady, unglamorous work. 9 o'clock, then, some indeterminate stretch of careful, unhurried effort later, the quarter hour. He worked slowly and on purpose, as he always did. There was a temptation, with the ones you knew, to rush through it, to get past the discomfort of handling someone who used to hand you cookies wrapped in foil. He'd known Rose the better part of his life, in the loose, cumulative way a town gives you people. A woman present at every parish function so consistently she'd become a kind of fixture. Marco didn't let himself rush. If anything, knowing someone made him slower, more careful, more inclined to treat every step as its own small act of attention, rather than a box to check on the way to the next one. He started with her hands, the way his father had taught him years back, hands first. Always. Because they were what people looked at longest at a viewing, whether they meant to or not. Roses were small and soft-knuckled, a thin gold band worn nearly smooth from 50-some years on the same finger. Marco cleaned under each nail with the same care he'd have given his own mother, working a soft brush in slow circles, and found himself thinking, not for the first time that morning, about the last time those hands had done anything at all reaching for a fork at the dessert table. Most likely, still telling some story to whoever would listen. He remembered her hands from years back, pressing a foil-wrapped plate into his at the farmer's market, insisting he take it even after he told her twice he had cookies enough at home. "Take it or I'll be offended," she'd said, in the way she had of making an ordinary kindness sound like she was doing you a favor by allowing you to accept it. He'd taken it. He always took it. It had never once occurred to him not to. Her hair took longer than usual, the hair as it got with age, requiring a gentler touch than the setting comb wanted to give it. And Marco worked through it patiently, section by section. The same unhurried rhythm carrying him from one small task to the next, without any of them announcing themselves as more important than the others. He'd learned this discipline from his father before he'd learned almost anything else about the trade. That the work asked for exactly the same attention whether you'd known the person 40 years or never met them at all. And that any shortcut you allowed yourself with one would eventually find its way into how you treated the other. Rose's good winter coat had come in with her, the family having asked that it be kept close by rather than sent home separately. Something about wanting her buried in it. A detail Marco intended to honor without needing it explained further. He set it aside on the prep table's edge before beginning, meaning to deal with it once the rest of the work was further along. It was almost an hour in, hands moving through the unhurried rhythm of the morning's work, before he came back to the coat and noticed something on the left cuff, a pale, gritty residue, dried into the wool in a faint ring near the sleeve's edge. He rubbed a small amount between two fingers. Salt-based, clearly, the kind used to melt ice off a walkway, but coarser than what he'd expect. Rose's Street got the finer residential product, the stuff the town spread from the smaller trucks on quiet roads. He knew this as he knew most small details about Mirefield's rhythms, without ever having had a reason to think about it directly until now. This was heavier, more industrial, closer to what got put down on parking lots and commercial properties than what got scattered on a sidewalk in front of somebody's house. He turned the cuff over once more and filed the detail away without much weight attached to it. People pick things up on their clothes constantly, brushed against railings, leaned on things, walked through more places in an evening than anyone accounted for afterward. He set the coat aside to continue with what the morning actually required of him. The bells rang again, distant enough now to blend almost entirely into the room's own quiet hum. He moved to Rose's feet last, as he generally did, working from the parts of the body most people thought about first toward the parts they generally forgot existed at all. It was routine, a step that happened at the tail end of hundreds of preparations without any particular weight attached to it. A washcloth, warm water, the same unhurried attention he'd given everything else that morning. There was a small mark between two of her toes, a single point, faint, almost nothing. The sort of thing that could pass for the mildest irritation if a person wasn't looking closely, and even then could be explained 100 ordinary ways. A faint chemical smell clung to the skin around it, something clean and sharp. the kind of smell that belonged more to a doctor's office than a woman's own bedroom. Marco held her foot a little longer than the step required, not yet understanding why the small mark had made him pause at all. It took a moment, an actual, measurable moment, his hands gone still over the basin while some slower part of his mind worked to catch up with what his eyes had already registered. Before the fact arrived, Rose was diabetic. He'd known this, the ordinary way a person knows things about people they've spent decades around, without ever needing the information directly. It came from parish health talks, where Rose herself, without any self-consciousness at all, had mentioned her injection site more than once, waving off anyone's concern with the same easy hand she waved off most things, her stomach. Always her stomach. A detail she'd offered so casually and so often it had simply become part of the general knowledge a town accumulates about its own people, filed away and forgotten until this exact instant required it back. Nobody injected insulin into their foot. Nobody's doctor would have told them to. And Rose, careful and practiced after decades of managing the same condition, wasn't the kind of woman who'd have improvised a new site on a whim. The realization didn't arrive as anything dramatic. There was no jolt, no sudden stillness in his chest, no sharp intake of breath. Nothing a person less accustomed to this room and this kind of information might have shown. It arrived instead the way a fact settles into place, a half-beat after it should have. The small mark had been there the whole time, waiting. And it was only now, with the missing piece of Rose's own habits finally caught up to it, that the wrongness of its location became visible for what it actually was. Marco stood there a moment longer than the work required, the bells from St. Raphael's sounding once more, thinner now, further away, as if the morning itself had moved on without waiting for him. He thought about the coat, the residue on the cuff, dismissed a moment ago as nothing much, was a detail that had nothing to do, on its own, with a needle mark in the wrong place on a dead woman's foot. But taken together, in the quiet of a room built for exactly this kind of unhurried attention, the two small things sat differently than they had 5 minutes earlier. Marco didn't have a name for what he was looking at yet, and he was careful, standing there, not to reach for one too quickly. He'd been wrong before, jumping ahead of what the evidence actually supported, but something about the shape of this sat wrong in a way that plain accident didn't quite explain a woman who knew her own body's routine as well as anyone in town, marked in a place that routine would never have taken her. He finished the rest of the preparation just as he'd started it, slowly, carefully, giving Rose the same unhurried attention he'd have given her regardless of what he now suspected. Whatever had happened to her, she deserved that much from him without condition. It was only once the work was fully done, the room quiet again, except for the fan's low hum, that Marco allowed himself to actually stand with the thought rather than around it. A needle mark in a place Rose wouldn't have chosen, a residue that didn't belong to her own street. Neither one, alone, was much of anything. Together, in a room that had taught him over the years to trust exactly this kind of quiet accumulation. They were enough to make him uneasy in a way the morning's earlier, ordinary sadness hadn't managed on its own. He looked at the clock. 11:30. Somewhere across town. St. Raphael's bells would be marking the same hour, faint enough by now that a person would have to be listening for them at all to notice. Marco went to wash his hands and to think, carefully, about who he needed to talk to first. Chapter 3. Nadia's car was parked crooked in the gravel lot beside St. Raphael's when Marco pulled in, its nose a half-foot further over the painted line than it needed to be, exactly the way she always parked when she was already thinking about the next 3 things on her list before she'd even turned the engine off. She was coming out of the parish hall's side entrance as he crossed the lot, a folder of table linens under one arm, already talking before either of them had properly said hello. "Don't get excited. I'm not here about you," she said. Father Dom's letting me use the hall in June for the Sorensen-Reyes wedding, and I needed measurements for the head table. I wasn't getting excited. You get a look. She fell into step beside him for a few paces, toward the lot's edge where her car waited. How's the DeMarco family holding up? About as well as you'd expect. I'm heading in to finalize Thursday with Father Dom now. Nadia's expression softened, briefly, as it did when a subject shifted from professional to something she actually cared about. Tell him Jesse started his first full week back on Monday. He wanted him to know, since Father Dom's the one who set up the whole arrangement with the fund. I'll tell him. Good. She was already moving again, keys out, the conversation closing without much ceremony, as most of her conversations did. Say hi to Agnes for me if you see her before Thursday. She was in her car and backing out before Marco had crossed the rest of the lot. He watched her go for a second, filing the small good news away before heading in through the side door. The hallway beyond was lined with framed photographs of parish groups going back decades, First Communion classes, building committees, a faded shot of the choir standing in front of a church that still had its old steeple, the one replaced sometime in the 80s after a storm took half of it down. Marco had walked this hallway more times than he could count, and it never occurred to him anymore to actually look at the photographs. The way a person stopped noticing wallpaper they'd lived with long enough. A boy of maybe 10 was kneeling by the supply closet at the end of the hall, sorting through a box of altar candles with the serious concentration only a child could bring to a task nobody else particularly cared about, counting them out in stacks of 5 and murmuring the numbers under his breath. "You're one of the Bianchi boys, aren't you?" Marco said, more observation than question. The boy looked up, startled out of his counting. "Yes, sir. Father Dom said we're low for Thursday and asked if I'd check." "Thursday's a big one. Good, you're on top of it." The boy nodded seriously and went back to his stacks. Marco continued down the hall, past the last of the photographs, toward the rectory office at the end, where a light was already on under the door. The office smelled as it always did. Old paper, candle wax, the mustiness of a room that had held the same furniture for 40 years. Father Dom sat behind a desk that had belonged to his predecessor, and probably the predecessor before that. Papers stacked in the kind of order only he could navigate, a crucifix on the wall behind him, slightly crooked in a way nobody had bothered to fix in living memory. Marco had sat across from him in this exact chair more times than he could count, as a boy waiting for his father to finish some piece of parish business, as a young man arranging his own father's funeral. And now, more times than he liked to think about, arranging someone else's. Whatever else changed in Mirefield, this room seemed to hold itself apart from it. "Rose's arrangements," Marco said, setting a folder on the desk between them. "The family wants Thursday, if the church calendar allows it." Father Dom glanced at the calendar pinned beside his phone, more out of habit than necessity. Marco suspected he already knew the answer before looking. "Thursday's fine. We'll do the 10 o'clock, same as always." He set the folder aside without opening it, as he usually did with these things, trusting Marco to have handled the details correctly before it ever reached his desk. "How's the family holding up?" "About how you'd expect. Danny's trying to keep it together for his mother's sake. Ruth Palmieri feels responsible somehow for not calling earlier, even though there's nothing she could have done differently. There rarely is, and it rarely stops people from believing there was." Father Dom leaned back, the chair creaking under him as it had for years. "I keep thinking about her at the dinner. She was in fine form that night. Told the Ferris wheel story again. I think I've heard that story a dozen times, and it gets funnier every time. Somehow, she was good at that, making something you'd heard before sound like the first time. She was—" Father Dom was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet a man allows himself when he's genuinely thinking rather than performing thought for someone else's benefit. 78 years in this parish, more or less. Baptized here, married here, buried her husband from here. I've done a lot of funerals in this building, Marco, and some of them barely touch me anymore. God forgive me for saying it. This one touches me. Marco let that sit for a moment before answering. She used to bring me cookies. No reason, just that she'd made too many, or she thought I looked like I needed feeding. I've still got the container on my counter, meaning to give it back to her. That sounds like Rose, Father Dom smiled, small and genuine. She did that for half the parish one time or another. Never made a thing of it. You'd find a plate on your porch and never even see her leave it. They sat with that a moment, the office quiet except for the radiator ticking somewhere in the wall. And then Marco. In the unhurried way conversations sometimes drifted without anyone steering them on purpose, found himself asking, "How long have you been here now? At the parish, I mean." "Coming up on 30 years next spring. Long enough to have buried people's grandparents and now their grandchildren, which is either a blessing or a sign I should retire, depending on the day you ask me." Father Dom rubbed at his jaw, a habit Marco had noticed in him before, usually when he was settling into a story rather than starting one. "You wouldn't remember the old neighborhood, would you? Down by where the workshop district used to be, before they rebuilt half of it? You'd have been a boy." "I remember pieces. My father used to take deliveries down that way sometimes. It was a different place back then. Tighter. Everybody's business a little more everybody else's business than it is now. If you can imagine that being possible in this town." Father Dom's eyes went somewhere distant, the way a person's did when a memory surfaced without being summoned for any particular reason. "There was a fire down there once. Must be 25 years now, give or take. Burned one of the old workshop buildings clean to the ground. I was younger then, newer to the parish. And I remember it shook people up for a while. Nobody hurt, thank God. But a fire like that in a neighborhood built that close together could have been so much worse." "I don't think I ever knew the details. Not sure anyone fully did, if I'm honest. Officially, it was the wiring old building, old wiring, the kind of thing that happens more than people like to think about." Father Dom's hand moved absently across the desk, straightening a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. "There was talk, for a while. There's always talk when a fire like that happens, and somebody ends up collecting an insurance payout not long after. People wondered, the way people do, whether it was really the wiring or whether somebody had helped it along. Nothing ever came of it. No investigation worth the name, as I recall. The fire marshal called it accidental, and that was more or less the end of it, officially. But you know how a town holds on to a rumor even after the official story closes the book? It lingered for a year or two, and then it faded. Once there was some newer thing for people to talk about instead." "Do you remember whose building it was?" "Ferraro's, though not where it sits now. A few doors down from the current shop, if I've got my geography right after all these years. The uncle ran it back then. Sal, God rest him, was a good man. Gave generously to this parish for as long as I knew him, right up until he passed. Tony's had the business in his own name a good while now. Built it up further than his uncle ever did, if you ask me. Hard to imagine that whole stretch of buildings the way it used to be." Father Dom shook his head slowly, the motion of a man marveling at how much a town could change out from under people who'd lived in it the whole time. "Funny. The things that stick in a person's memory and the things that don't. I couldn't tell you what I had for supper last Tuesday, but I remember standing in this rectory's front window watching that smoke go up, thinking it looked close enough to reach the church itself if the wind turned wrong." Marco nodded, filing the details away without comment, careful to keep the question he'd asked sounding like exactly what it had started as, an idle curiosity about a town he'd grown up in and only half known, not a question he was asking because he was looking for something specific. "Was there ever a fire marshal's report, something on record?" "There would have been, somewhere. If the town kept things that far back, you'd want the library for that, Or the county records office if Patricia doesn't have it. I only know what I remember, and memory's a poor substitute for a document, especially after 25 years. Father Dom's watchful eye, the one his parishioners had come to rely on without quite naming it that way, settled on Marco for a moment, mild and unhurried. Why the sudden interest in an old fire? Not like you to go digging through ancient history without a reason. No reason, really. Marco said it easily, and it was mostly true. He had nothing yet that connected Rose's death to a fire 25 years gone. Nothing but a small, uneasy feeling that a residue on a coat cuff and a needle mark in the wrong place deserved more looking into than the town's easy explanation had given them. Rose mentioned the old neighborhood at the dinner is all. Got me thinking about how much of the town's history I never actually learned. Good a reason as any. Father Dom seemed satisfied with that, and the conversation drifted naturally on from there toward Thursday's service and whether the choir would sing the piece Rose had always requested at other people's funerals, joking more than once that she wanted it at her own. By the time Marco left the rectory, the light outside had gone thin and gray, on an afternoon that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be winter or something gentler. He carried the folder back to the van with him, the funeral details settled, and underneath them, unspoken, a name he now had that he hadn't had that morning, Ferraro's, sitting quietly at the edge of a thought he wasn't ready to finish yet. Chapter 4. The Library. The Mirefield Public Library still had its original reading room. High windows and dark wood shelving that had survived 3 separate renovation committees over the decades, mostly because nobody could ever agree on what to replace it with. A young man Marco didn't recognize sat behind the main desk, headphones around his neck, sorting a returns cart with the distracted efficiency of someone counting the minutes until his shift ended. "Patricia's in the back," he said. Before Marco had finished crossing the lobby, "She said if you came in to just go on through, said you'd know the way." Marco did know the way past the periodicals, down a short hallway lined with framed maps of the county at various points in its history, to a door marked Local History Archives, in lettering old enough to have been hand-painted rather than printed. The parish newsletter had been sitting on the passenger seat of Marco's van since he left the rectory the day before, tucked into the folder along with Rose's funeral paperwork. Father Dom's assistant must have slipped a spare copy in without either of them noticing, the kind of small, harmless mistake that happened when a folder passed through enough hands. Marco found it again only when he reached for his keys outside the library. The newsletter's cover photo catching his eye before he'd meant to look at it at all. A black and white shot of the parish building committee from some anniversary years back. A line of solemn faces standing in front of the church's old steeple, the one that had come down in a storm before Marco was old enough to remember it standing. He set it on the passenger seat again, meaning nothing by the coincidence, and went inside. The library kept its local history material in a back room most patrons never had reason to visit. Shelves of bound newspapers and county records overseen, as far as Marco could tell, entirely by force of Patricia Sue's own memory, rather than any formal cataloging system a stranger could have made sense of. She was up on the rolling ladder when he came in, one hand braced against a shelf, working her way along a row of dates stamped in faded gold on old leather spines. 25 years back, Patricia said, not turning around, already climbing down before Marco had finished explaining what he was after. "You'll want the Gazette, not the Courier. The Courier didn't cover much outside the town center in those years, and a workshop fire on the old district's edge would have fallen outside their beat." She moved to a lower shelf instead, running a finger along a row of dates with a familiarity that didn't need to check labels twice, and pulled down a heavy-bound volume, laying it flat on the reading table. "Late winter, you said February, maybe March." Father Dom thought February. Father Dom's usually right about dates. Priests keep better calendars than most people in my experience. It comes from having to remember whose anniversary mass is when. She turned pages with a practiced, careful touch, the volume's binding stiff with age, each page giving off a faint smell of old newsprint and the specific dust that collected in rooms nobody aired out often enough. I reorganized this whole section myself, back when I first started. Nobody had touched it in years. Half the volumes were shelved by whoever happened to be reshelving that week. No order to it at all. Took me the better part of a summer to get it into anything a person could actually use. She said it without any particular pride, as a person might mention a fact about their own life that had simply always been true. She found the week in question and turned the volume so Marco could see it, then stood beside him rather than returning to her desk, which wasn't her usual habit. Patricia generally left a person to their own reading once she'd pointed them toward the material. The article was brief. Tucked below the fold on an inside page, a small fire, no injuries, the wiring blamed within the first paragraph, and the story more or less closed by the second. A grainy photograph accompanied it, firefighters working the scene, a knot of bystanders gathered at a safe distance behind them. The crowd that assembled at any fire, regardless of the hour, drawn by something in people that couldn't help but watch. "I remember this," Patricia said, quieter than her usual register, almost to herself. "Not the article. I was a child. I wouldn't have read the paper at that age. But the fire itself. My mother woke me up that night, wrapped me in a blanket, took me out onto the porch because half the street had gone outside to watch the sky. I remember the color of it more than anything. That orange a fire gets when it's got real fuel in it." She was quiet a moment, her eyes still on the photograph, somewhere further away than the reading room. "Funny what stays. I couldn't tell you what year I started working here, not without checking a file, but I remember standing on that porch in my nightgown like it was last week." Marco looked up from the article. He'd known Patricia the better part of a decade. Professionally warm, but never anything close to this. "I didn't know you grew up that close to it." "Different street, but close enough to see the sky change color. Everyone in that end of town saw it, one way or another." She seemed to catch herself then, the moment closing as quickly as it had opened, her composure settling back into its usual shape. "Anyway, that's not research. That's just an old woman's memory, and memory's not what you came here for." "It's not nothing, either." Patricia didn't answer that directly, but something in her expression suggested she'd heard it and filed it away, the same way she filed most things. Marco returned his attention to the photograph, studying the loose crowd of bystanders behind the working firefighters' faces, half lit by the fire's own glow. The way people looked in photographs from fires and disasters generally, caught in an expression somewhere between concern and a fascination they'd never admit to feeling. He scanned the row without any particular purpose at first, simply taking in the scene Father Dom had described to him the day before, until his eyes settled on one face near the edge of the group and stayed there without his quite understanding why. A young man, maybe 30, dark hair, standing slightly apart from the others in a way that could have meant anything closer to the fire than most people would stand, or simply positioned there by chance. One face in a crowd photograph, ending up where it did for no reason worth remembering. Marco looked at it a long moment before it landed. Something in the set of the jaw, or the way the man held his shoulders. No, just the shoulders themselves, square and still in a manner Marco realized he'd seen recently, in a much older face, standing behind a shop counter running a hand over a piece of furniture he was working on. "Patricia." She came back to the table at the change in his voice. "Do you have a magnifying glass? Or is there somewhere I can get a clearer copy of this?" She produced a glass from a drawer without asking why, and Marco held it over the photograph, over the young man's face, for longer than the article's actual content warranted. The resemblance wasn't proof of anything. Faces changed over 25 years, and a grainy newspaper photograph from that distance could make one young man look like any number of other young men. but the longer Marco looked, the more the shape of it held the set of the jaw. Yes, but also something in how the young man stood, watching the fire rather than fleeing from it, present at a scene he had, as far as anyone at the time seemed to think, no particular reason to be standing at all. "Recognize someone?" Patricia asked. "I'm not sure yet." Marco kept his voice even, just as he had with Father Dom, careful not to let the question carry more weight than an idle observation deserved. "There's a resemblance to someone I know. Probably nothing. 25 years is a long time, and faces change." "They do," Patricia agreed, though something in the way she said it suggested she didn't entirely believe the resemblance was as coincidental as Marco was making it sound, and she didn't press further either. The same discretion she'd shown him at the reading table, more times than either of them had ever needed to acknowledge out loud. "Want a copy of the page? I can run it through the machine before you go." "Please." She made the copy without another word about it, feeding the brittle page through the machine with a care that suggested she'd damaged one too many old originals early in her career and never forgotten the lesson. Marco folded the copy carefully into the same folder that still held Rose's funeral paperwork. Outside. The afternoon had gone the flat gray of a sky that couldn't decide on rain, and Marco sat in the van a moment before starting the engine. The newsletter with the old steeple photograph still sitting untouched on the passenger seat. The two images, one entirely unrelated, one that might mean everything. Riding home together without either of them saying a word about it. Chapter 5. Two small threads. Sal's diner filled up the same way it always did on a weekday morning, regulars claiming their usual stools without needing to ask, the specials board still smudged from where someone had erased Tuesday's soup to write in Wednesday's. Marco came in for coffee and nothing more, meaning to be in and out inside 10 minutes, and might have managed it if Agnes Kowalski hadn't been sitting at the counter already, halfway through her own cup and clearly in the mood to talk. "You hear about Colm Brennan making a scene at his own parish's dinner last week?" Agnes said, before Marco had even gotten his coat off. "Apparently he got into it with somebody over the seating chart. Man's 60 years old and still can't let a seating chart go." "When was this?" "Same night as ours, if you can believe the coincidence. Both parishes running their fundraisers the same evening. And I heard from Rita, who works the register at the hardware store, that half his own parish was laughing about it for days after. Something about him and old Mrs. Doyle both wanting the table by the window." Marco turned that over for a moment, setting his coat back down on the stool beside him rather than putting it on. So he was there the whole night, at his own dinner. From what I hear, he barely left the room. He was so busy being outraged about a table. Agnes shook her head, more amused than anything. "Man's all bark, that one. Always has been, long as I've known him. All that business with Rose over the years, the bake sale thing, the hall dispute, was never anything but the two of them liking a good argument more than they liked winning one." It settled something Marco hadn't realized he was still half carrying. A loose thread from the days right after Rose's death when Colm's name had come up more than once. An old friction between two people who'd apparently enjoyed the friction as much as anything else. A room full of witnesses at his own dinner, arguing about a seating chart. Put Colm about as far from Rose's front hallway that night as a person in this town could get. He finished his coffee and let the conversation move on to other things. The second thread came apart almost as easily, a day or two later, in a conversation Marco hadn't gone looking for. He was at the funeral home going over Thursday's final details with Rose's family when Danny, sitting across the desk looking younger and more tired than a man his age had any business looking, brought it up himself, unprompted. "I feel sick about that joke I made," Danny said, not for the first time since Rose's death. "The China thing. People heard it, and I know how it looked." "Nobody who knows you thought anything of it," Marco said. "It was mostly true, and mostly what the moment called for. My mother told me I should have been in Ohio anyway, visiting my cousin. Instead of standing around making jokes I'd regret, I was supposed to drive out that same week, but I pushed it back for the dinner. Danny rubbed at his eyes. I ended up going 2 days later, 2 states away by the time it happened. My cousin can vouch. If anybody ever needed her to, not that I think anybody would. Marco hadn't been looking for that confirmation. Hadn't even realized until it arrived how much weight he'd still been quietly carrying around Danny's joke. The small inheritance, the plain awkwardness of grief making a person say something they didn't mean. But there it was, offered without Marco having to ask for it at all. Danny, 2 states away within days of the dinner. An aunt or a cousin somewhere who could confirm it without anyone needing to make a formal thing of asking. Nobody's going to need to vouch for anything, Marco told him. And meant it, and felt the second thread come loose the same quiet way the first one had. More a settling than a discovery. Resolved in the ordinary traffic of daily conversation rather than through anything Marco had gone hunting for directly. It was the de-icer that took real thought, in a way the other 2 threads hadn't. Marco found himself circling back to it that evening, alone in the funeral home's small office after the family had gone. The residue from Rose's coat cuff sitting in his mind the way an unfinished sentence sits in a person's head, demanding to be completed even when there was no obvious next step toward completing it. Commercial grade. He kept coming back to that. Not what got spread on residential streets. Not what the town trucks put down on Rose's own block or the church walkway. Something heavier, meant for parking lots and loading areas that needed to stay clear for trucks and deliveries rather than for a woman walking carefully to her own front door. He thought about which businesses in the parish used that grade of product. It wasn't a long list once he actually sat with it. Mirefield wasn't a large enough town to have many commercial properties requiring that kind of maintenance, and fewer still that a woman like Rose would have had any reason to walk near on an ordinary evening. The groceries loading dock. Maybe. The hardware store's back lot. And Ferraro's Tony's shop, with its wide gravel lot out back, where deliveries of lumber and fabric rolls came and went. A lot Marco had driven past 100 times without ever once thinking about what kept it clear through the winter months. He sat with that a long moment, turning it over slowly, as he'd turn over any piece of evidence that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to mean. On its own, a de-icer residue proved nothing. Rose could have brushed against any number of surfaces in the course of an ordinary evening, could have leaned against a car, a railing, a dozen things Marco would never be able to account for after the fact. But set beside the photograph still sitting in his folder, the resemblance he still hadn't fully convinced himself of. And Father Dom's fragments about a fire and an old insurance rumor. Set beside all of it, the residue stopped feeling like nothing. He didn't reach for a conclusion. He was careful about that. The same care he'd been exercising since the moment in the prep room when the needle mark first refused to sit right in his mind. A resemblance in an old photograph. A residue that pointed loosely toward a handful of commercial properties, one of which happened to belong to a man who'd walked Rose home the night she died. None of it, alone, was proof of anything a person could bring to Gus with a straight face. But it was no longer nothing either. And Marco found himself sitting alone in the quiet office with the day's last light gone from the window, doing the kind of slow, careful arithmetic that had never once, in his experience, turned out to be worth ignoring. He closed the folder, turned off the desk lamp, and sat a moment longer in the dark before finally heading home. Chapter 6. The sheriff's office occupied a squat brick building 2 blocks off the town square, unchanged as far as Marco could tell, since he was a boy being sent in with paperwork for his father. The front room still had the same scarred linoleum, the same bulletin board thick with layers of notices nobody had bothered to take down, a candy dish on the corner of Gus's desk that got refilled with the same cheap butterscotch drops every few weeks without anyone ever discussing whose job that was. Gus was on the phone when Marco came in, boots up on an open drawer, saying, "Uh-huh," at intervals in a tone that suggested whoever was on the other end wasn't telling him anything he hadn't already guessed. He waved Marco toward the chair across the desk without breaking the rhythm of the call, and Marco sat, setting the folder in his lap, waiting as he'd waited in that chair a dozen times before. That was the county about a fence line dispute nobody's going to remember caring about in a year, Gus said. Hanging up, what have you got? Marco set the folder on the desk and opened it without preamble that aboard of long of the needle mark. The residue on the coat cuff, Father Dom's fragments about the old fire, the photograph from the Gazette, the de-icer connection to Ferraro's lot. He laid it out as he always tried to, plainly, without dressing it up more than the facts themselves supported, careful the whole time to present it as what it was, pieces that had started fitting together, not a conclusion he was asking Gus to simply accept. Gus listened without interrupting. That wasn't unusual, but something in the stillness of it was. He wasn't working through the details with his usual half-skeptical patience. Wasn't reaching for the candy dish or leaning back in the chair the way he did when he was turning something over. He sat forward instead, elbows on the desk, and by the time Marco reached the end of it, laying the photograph down last, Gus hadn't moved at all. He reached up and took off his glasses and set them on the desk beside the photograph. For a long moment he didn't say anything, looking at the grainy image of the young man standing apart from the crowd. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the flat, procedural edge it usually carried in this room. Rose DeMarco. He said it quietly, almost to himself, like he was testing whether saying it out loud made it any more real than it had been a minute ago. Christ. He rubbed at his eyes with the heel of one hand. I've known that woman since I was hardly older than you are now. She used to bring a plate to every department Christmas party for 30 years running. My wife still talks about her cannoli. Marco stayed quiet, letting him have the moment rather than filling it. I keep thinking I saw her a week before all this, at the hardware store, of all places, buying an extension cord for some Christmas lights she was too stubborn to take down early. Told me she liked looking at them past the holiday, said it was nobody's business but hers how long she kept her porch lit up. Gus put the glasses back on, but his hand lingered a moment at the bridge of his nose. The gesture of a man giving himself one more second before he had to be something other than a person who'd just lost someone he cared about. And now you're telling me somebody walked her home and did this to her? I'm telling you what I found. I'm not telling you I know for certain what it means. No, Gus agreed. But you don't bring me a folder like this unless you've already decided it means something, and you're usually right when you decide that. He looked at the photograph again, this time with something closer to his usual working focus returning to his face, though it hadn't fully replaced what had been there a moment before. Tony Ferraro. I'm not certain. It's a resemblance, 25 years old, in a photograph that could be anybody at that distance. It's not anybody. You don't drive 2 towns over with a maybe. Gus pulled a legal pad toward him and started writing, the pen moving in short, economical strokes. Insurance on the old workshop, you said. Whose name was that in? His uncle's. Sal ran the business back then. Tony was working under him. So if there was ever a reason somebody set that fire, it wasn't for Tony's own payout. Gus tapped the pen against the pad, thinking it through out loud, as he sometimes did when a case had enough moving pieces that talking helped him see the shape of it. Explains why nobody ever looked twice at him at the time. Wrong name on the policy. That's what I thought, too. Gus was quiet another moment, and when he looked up, his face had settled into something Marco recognized, not the personal grief from a few minutes ago. Folded away now, but clearly not gone. And not yet the fully procedural mask Gus wore through most of a confrontation, but somewhere in between. A man getting ready to do a hard thing for someone he genuinely cared about. I'll need a day or two to put this together properly before I go anywhere near him. Gus said, You did right bringing it to me instead of sitting on it. And you did right not going anywhere near Tony yourself in the meantime. That stays true going forward. Whatever happens next, it happens through me. I know how this works. I know you do. Gus closed the folder, but didn't hand it back yet, his hand resting flat on the cover a moment longer, as if he needed the extra second before setting the conversation down entirely. Rose DeMarco, he said again, quieter this time, and then, standing, reaching for his jacket off the back of the chair. Go on home. Castellano, I'll take it from here. Marco stood and left him there, still sitting with his hand on the folder, the candy dish untouched on the corner of the desk. Chapter 7. Tony Ferraro's upholstery and furniture repair sat on a corner lot that had been rebuilt sometime in the 70s. Low and practical, more workshop than storefront, with a gravel lot out back where a delivery truck sat backed up to a loading door. Marco rode with Gus in the cruiser, neither of them saying much on the way over. The radio turned down low enough to be background noise rather than company. You don't have to come in, Gus said, pulling into a spot across the street rather than directly in front. I can do this on my own. I know, but you're coming anyway? I've known him longer than most of the parish has. Seems like the kind of thing where a familiar face in the room might make it easier on everyone. Or it might not. I'd rather be there than wonder about it after. Gus didn't argue further. He sat a moment with his hands still on the wheel, looking at the shop's front window, where a half-finished armchair sat visible through the glass, its frame stripped down to bare wood and springs, waiting for whatever came next in its own slow repair. You stay by the door. You don't say anything unless I ask you something directly. This isn't a conversation you're part of. Understood. They crossed the street together. A bell over the door announced them. The same bell that had announced customers into that shop for longer than Marco had been alive. And Tony looked up from a workbench in the back, wiping his hands on a rag, his face arranging itself into the easy, welcoming expression of a man who'd spent decades being glad to see whoever walked through his door. Gus? Marco? He set the rag down. Don't usually get the sheriff in here unless something's wrong with my truck's registration again. The joke came out easily, the kind of thing he'd probably said a dozen times over the years, and for a moment it landed the way it was meant to, light. Unremarkable. Exactly what a person expected from Tony Ferraro on an ordinary afternoon. Gus didn't return the smile. Got a few things I need to go over with you, Tony. Might be easier if we sat down somewhere. Something shifted in Tony's face at that small. Almost nothing. The kind of change a person might miss if they weren't watching for it. He glanced toward the back office, then at Marco standing near the door, then back at Gus. And whatever calculation ran through him in that moment settled, visibly, into something closer to resignation than confusion. Office is this way, he said, and led them back without another word. The office was small, cluttered with invoices and fabric samples, a space heater humming in the corner against the cold that never quite left an old building like this one. Tony sat behind his desk. Gus took the chair across from him. Marco stood near the door, exactly where he'd been told to stand. The folder from his conversation with Gus a couple of days back now sitting closed on the desk between them. I want to talk to you about the night of the street, Raphael's dinner, Gus said. About Rose. Tony's hands resting on the desk went very still. Terrible thing. I still can't believe it. Honestly, walked her home myself that night, you know? Made sure she got in safe. I know you did. Gus's voice stayed level, without accusation. The way Marco had watched him work a dozen times before, laying facts down one at a time, giving a person room to fill the silence however they chose to. I also know a few other things. About a fire, 25 years back. About an old photograph that puts a young man at the scene, watching it burn instead of running from it. The room went very quiet. The space heater ticked in the corner. That's a long time ago, Gus. Tony's voice had changed, some of its easy warmth gone out of it, though he wasn't yet giving anything away outright. Still holding to the shape of a man being unfairly questioned about ancient history. A lot of people were standing around watching that fire. Whole neighborhood came out. Sure, but not many of them had an uncle who collected the insurance on the building 3 months later. Tony didn't answer that. His jaw worked once, a small motion, and his eyes went to the desk, to the closed folder, to some point past all of it that neither Gus nor Marco could see. Rose saw you, Gus said, quieter now. That night, 25 years ago, walking home from a cousin's, saw a young man coming out the back of that workshop not long before it went up. Didn't think anything of it at the time, didn't even fully remember it, most likely until something at that dinner brought it back to her. Sitting at a table telling old stories the way she liked to do, he let that sit a moment. She wasn't accusing you of anything, Tony. She probably didn't even know it was you, not for certain, not after all that time. She was just an old woman remembering a night from a long time ago, out loud, at a dinner table, the way people do. Something in Tony's face broke then. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way ice breaks on a pond that's been thinning for longer than anyone watching realized. A slow give rather than a sudden crack. He put both hands flat on the desk and looked down at them. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost whatever fight had still been in it a moment before. I heard her. He said it almost too quiet to catch, and then louder, like he needed to hear himself say it out loud to believe it was finally happening. I heard her say it, sitting 3 tables over dessert, saying it like it was nothing, like it was just a funny old memory to trot out with the Ferris wheel story and the rest of it. He shook his head slowly. 25 years, and there it was, just sitting in her mouth the whole time, and she didn't even know what she was holding. What happened? Tony. Gus's voice stayed steady, not pushing, just present. I stepped out, told Teresa I needed air. She came with me, because that's what Teresa does. She always comes with me. And I said... His voice caught, and he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment before continuing. I don't even know what I said to her out there. Something. Enough that she knew something was wrong, though she had no idea what, God help her. She still doesn't know. Not really. Not until you tell her. He dropped his hands. I've been carrying this since I was 33 years old. You understand that? 33. I've been an old man carrying it longer than I was young without it. Tell me about the fire, Gus said. Tony was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke again it came out slower, more measured. The words of a man finally setting something down after holding it so long his hands had forgotten how to do anything else. Sal was going under. Business was failing. Had been for 2 years, and he wouldn't admit it to anybody, not even himself. I don't think... He'd taken a second mortgage on the building just to keep the lights on, and I knew I was young, but I wasn't stupid. I could see where it was heading. He was going to lose everything. The shop, the house, everything he'd built. And he'd taken me in when nobody else in the family wanted much to do with me, gave me a trade, a place, made me somebody instead of nobody. He rubbed at his jaw, an old man's gesture, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour of the day. I told myself I was doing it for him, and I was, partly. But I was doing it for myself, too, because if Sal went under, I went under with him, and I didn't have anywhere else to go. At 33, with no trade but the one he'd given me. So you set the fire... I set the fire. He said it plainly now, without flinching from it, the confession arriving less like a collapse and more like a long exhale. A weight finally shifted off a place that had held it too long to remember what it felt like without it. Made it look like the wiring. I knew enough about the building to know where to make it look natural. Waited until everyone had gone home for the night. And then I came back, later, and stood there with everybody else and watched it burn. Because I couldn't make myself stay away. I told myself I wanted to make sure nobody got hurt. And maybe that was even true. A little. But mostly I think I just needed to see it happen. needed to watch it be real. And Sal never knew. Sal never knew a thing. Collected the insurance, rebuilt clean, thanked God for a stroke of terrible luck that turned out, in his words, to be the making of him. I let him believe that his whole life. Buried him 12 years ago, still believing it. Tony's voice cracked on that, the first real break in it. Everything I built after, this shop, this life, Teresa, all of it, sits on top of that fire, and I've known it every single day for 25 years. Every donation I made to that church. Every board I sat on. Every time somebody called me a good man in this town. I knew what it was actually built on. The whole time. You want to know what this is, Gus? It's not relief, exactly. It's like finally putting down something you forgot you were carrying. Because you've carried it so long it just became the shape of your own arms. Gus let the silence hold a moment before asking gently, "And Rose?" Tony's face changed again. The confession's strange, tired steadiness giving way to something rawer. I never meant to hurt anybody with the fire. Not then, and God knows not now. But I heard her say that at the table, and something in me just panicked. That's the only word for it. Even though it didn't feel like panic at the time, it felt almost calm. I told myself she probably didn't even remember it was me, that it would pass, that nobody was in danger. But I couldn't make myself believe it enough to just let it go. He looked up, and for the first time since the conversation started, looked directly at Marco standing by the door. I walked her home like I always would have, like it was nothing, and I told myself the whole way there that I wasn't going to do anything, that I just wanted to make sure she was safe. And then I was standing in her kitchen with her insulin in my hand, and He stopped, didn't finish it, didn't need to. The room held the silence for a long moment. "Teresa," Tony said finally, quieter, almost to himself. "She doesn't know any of this. Not the fire, not what I did to Rose. She's going to hear all of it for the first time from someone who isn't me. And I don't know how she survives that. 30 years married to a man who was never who she thought he was." His hands had started to shake, faintly, resting on the desk. "That's the part I can't get past. That's the part that doesn't get better with any of the rest of it settling. What this does to her." Gus stood, slow, giving the moment its due weight before moving into what needed to happen next. "Anthony Ferraro, I need you to come with me." Tony nodded and stood without resistance, some last piece of him seeming to loosen further as he did. A man walking toward something he'd been walking toward, without knowing it, for 25 years. Chapter 8. Teresa. The Ferraro house sat on a quiet street 2 blocks off the old workshop district, a modest 2-story with a wraparound porch Tony had rebuilt himself years back. According to something Marco half-remembered hearing at a parish function once, a small, unremarkable fact that meant nothing at the time and meant something different now. A neighbor's curtain moved slightly as Marco pulled up, then settled. The kind of watching a street does, when word has already traveled faster than any one official managed to explain it. Marco sat in the van a moment before getting out, unsure exactly what he'd come to offer, or whether there was anything worth offering at all. He wasn't family, he wasn't the law. He was only someone who'd known Tony the ordinary way a town knew its own tradesmen, and who'd been standing in the room when the whole shape of that knowing came apart. It didn't feel like enough of a reason to be here, and it didn't feel like a good enough reason to stay away, either. He found her on the front steps of the house she and Tony had shared for 30 years. Sitting rather than standing, a cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders against a cold she didn't seem to notice. A patrol car had come and gone an hour before, and word, in a town this size, had a way of arriving at a door faster than any one official ever managed to. She looked up when he came up the walk, and didn't seem surprised to see him. The way a person stops being surprised by anything, once the worst thing they could imagine has already happened. "Marco," She said his name simply, without any particular weight attached to it. I wondered if someone would come by. I don't have to stay. I just didn't want you sitting out here alone if you didn't have to. I don't mind the cold. She looked past him, toward the street, toward nothing in particular. It's strange. I keep waiting to feel something specific, and it just isn't specific. It's just this. She gestured vaguely at the air around her, at the porch, at the whole gray afternoon. Marco sat down on the step beside her, not too close, giving her the room she seemed to need without leaving her entirely alone with it. Neither of them said anything for a while. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet. I keep thinking about that night, Teresa said eventually. The corridor. He said he needed air, and I went with him because I always go with him. 30 years of just going with him, wherever he needs to go. And he said something out there. I don't even remember the words exactly, just that his voice sounded wrong. I asked him what was the matter, and he said it was nothing, just tired. And I believed him. I always believed him. She was quiet a moment. I've been trying to remember if I noticed anything different in him after that. Walking Rose home, coming back later than I expected. I don't know if I noticed and didn't think anything of it, or if there really was nothing to notice. I can't tell anymore which one is true. You couldn't have known. That's what everyone keeps telling me. My sister said it on the phone 20 minutes ago. I don't know that it helps. She looked down at her own hands, folded together in her lap, turning her wedding ring slowly with her thumb, around and around. The small motion of someone who needed somewhere to put their hands and had found, without quite deciding to, the one place they'd rested for 3 decades. 30 years, Marco. I keep doing the math without meaning to. 30 years married to a man I apparently never fully knew. And I can't decide if that makes every good year we had less real, or if it doesn't touch them at all. I go back and forth on it by the hour. I don't think anyone could tell you the answer to that. I'm not sure there is one, not yet. No, she kept turning the ring. He said something before they took him. One of the officers told me that he was sorry, mostly for what it does to me, as if that's the part I need him worrying about right now. Her voice didn't rise, didn't break, stayed instead in the same level, worn register it had held the whole conversation. I don't blame you. If that's what you're sitting here waiting to hear, you didn't do this. Rose didn't do this. He did this. 25 years before I even knew him, and then again 3 weeks ago. And none of that has a single thing to do with you standing on my porch being kind to me because you don't know what else to do. I don't, Marco admitted. Know what else to do? I mean, I just didn't want to leave you out here by yourself. I appreciate that. I do. She finally stopped turning the ring, let her hands go still in her lap, and looked out at the street again. At the ordinary gray afternoon that had somehow kept going despite everything. I think I'd like to sit here a while longer, though, just by myself, if that's all right. I don't think I'm ready yet for company, even kind company. Marco stood and left her there on the step, the cardigan pulled tight, her hands finally still. The whole quiet weight of 30 years settling around her in a way no one, least of all Marco, had any business trying to soften. Epilogue. Rose DeMarco's funeral filled St. Raphael's the way her fundraiser dinners always had. Every pew taken, folding chairs brought out along the back wall for the overflow. The same faces that had sat around her at dessert 2 weeks earlier, now sitting together in a different kind of gathering entirely. Father Dom presided with the same steady warmth he brought to everything, his voice carrying easily to the back of the church without needing to be raised. The kind of presence that made grief feel held rather than merely witnessed. He spoke about Rose the way people who'd known her best always seemed to not, with grand statements, but with small, specific things. the foil-wrapped plates left on porches without explanation. The Ferris wheel story told one more time than anyone technically needed to hear it. A woman who'd spent 78 years making sure the people around her felt fed in every sense the word could carry. She would tell you not to make a fuss, Father Dom said near the end, and a ripple of soft, knowing laughter moved through the pews. Because everyone in that room had heard Rose say exactly that, in exactly that tone, more times than they could count. So I won't. I'll only say that this parish is smaller today than it was 2 weeks ago. In a way, no number of new faces will ever quite fill back in, and that the smallness is worth grieving honestly, rather than rushing past. Marco sat toward the back, near the door, as he generally did at funerals that weren't his own family's to arrange. Agnes sat 2 rows up, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd clearly brought prepared for exactly this. Ruth Palmieri sat near the front with the DeMarco family, her hand resting on Danny's shoulder through most of the service. The 2 of them bound now by a mourning neither of them would ever fully set down. Nobody in the church, as far as Marco could tell, spoke Tony Ferraro's name once. It hung in the air, anyway, the way an absence does, present in every glance that didn't quite land where it used to, in the empty space at the edge of the parish's usual circle of donors and volunteers, where his name would ordinarily have been mentioned by now, the fundraiser's largest gift. The shop that sponsored the youth basketball jerseys every spring. The town would talk about all of it eventually, as it always did. But not today. Not in this room. Not while Rose's casket still sat at the front of the church, waiting to be carried back out into the cold. The service ended, as these things did, quietly, the organ carrying people out into the late February afternoon in 2s and 3s. Coats pulled tight, breath showing in the air. Marco stood outside afterward for a moment, near the church steps, watching the crowd disperse toward their cars, down the block, past the last of the departing mourners. A hardware store sign flickered against the gray sky. One letter burned out entirely, the rest of it holding on in an unsteady rhythm that had probably been going on for weeks without anyone bothering to fix it. The kind of small, ordinary neglect a town accumulated without noticing, right alongside everything else it managed to hold. He turned back toward the church itself before getting in the van, and his eye caught the bulletin board just inside the entrance, visible through the prop door, the usual clutter of parish notices, a bake sale flyer curling at one corner where the tape had given up its grip, a lost cat notice gone soft and gray with age. The ordinary business of a community continuing to schedule itself forward even on a day like this one. Someone would replace the curling flyer eventually, the same way someone would eventually get around to that flickering sign down the block. Not today. Today the board just held what it held, unremarkable and unhurried, the parish's small machinery of ordinary life ticking along beneath everything else. Marco got in the van and sat a moment before starting the engine, thinking about Rose's coat, the foil-wrapped plates, a 25-year-old fire, a man who'd finally set something down after carrying it longer than he'd carried anything else in his life. There was no clean shape to any of it, no version of the ending that felt like a victory worth naming. Just a town, quietly reassembling itself around a loss it hadn't asked for, as it always eventually did. One ordinary day arriving after another until the extraordinary one stopped feeling quite so sharp. He started the van and drove home,